What's up, Falcons fans, and welcome to episode 9 of Talking Birdie, an Atlanta Falcons podcast powered by sportstalkatl.com. I am your host, Matt Karoly. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Karoly, Karoly spelled Karoly. And tonight I am joined by one of my co-hosts from the Sports Talk ATL team, Jake Gordon, and a very, very special guest. This man needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyways. He is the Falcoholic himself, Dave Choate, founder and editor-in-chief of SB Nation's The Falcoholic. In my humble opinion, the gold standard of Atlanta Falcons coverage on the interwebs. Dave, thanks for taking the time out tonight to talk some Falcons with us. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, one of the reasons brought Dave on, not just because he's one of the best guys to talk to when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, but this has been one hell of an off season. I've gone on record a few times saying this is the most exhausting off season that I can remember in my 20 years being an Atlanta Falcons fan. And I know, Dave's been covering the Falcons longer than Jake and I have combined. And so I figured I wanted to start the conversation off tonight, getting his thoughts on this off season, because it's been unlike anything that I've experienced as a fan. And, again, Dave has more vivid memories. I know on Twitter, a lot of people kind of throw out the 2007 offseason as a close comparison, given, the legal battles surrounding the franchise player, Michael Vick, at that time. So, Dave, I wanted to ask you, how does this one stack up in your opinion? And, are you as exhausted as I am at this point in the offseason? Dave, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
There we go. No worries.
Quick freeze. It's a classic New Hampshire internet. Compared to 2007, I think 2007 was obviously worse. Like you can't really compare, being excited for a season and all of a sudden Joey Harrington's the starting quarterback and everything that you thought you were going to get has gone by the wayside. But also, I was a lot younger then, and I feel like I was less exhausted by the end of it because I could still talk myself into something good happening. And, I'm actually pretty optimistic about this season, but it's just been a lot. There's been a lot of change, a lot of debate, a lot of uncertainty. Certainly the Julio trade was, pretty devastating in its own right, for somebody who's a huge fan of Julio as I am. So, I would say the 2007 offseason really is the only comparable one. And even for that, we had some things to be excited about, obviously Joey Harrington not being one of them, but, so it's, in both cases, I think it's a long, tough off season, but in this case, things might actually turn out well. Whereas in hindsight, especially, nothing good was going to come out of 2007. So it was probably worth enduring this one in a way it wasn't back then.
And for those that do end up listening to this podcast, we didn't, plan on it being the Joey Harrington slander podcast, but, when it calls for it, again, I think Dave's spot on. I mean, 2007 it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's different in that, you're expecting to have your franchise player in Michael Vick, and then having a drop off like Joey Harrington to lead your team is totally different than kind of the debate that I think is what makes it exhausting. And that kind of brings me to my next question, because I think the biggest thing, and Dave's a huge presence on Twitter, and he sees it, and he sees it more than anyone does. I'm sure his comments have been, something to read. But the biggest thing I think is the divide in the fan base when it comes to, should the Falcons have decided to rebuild, sitting there at 4th overall, should they have thought more about the future quarterback versus, the reload, which again, I haven't made it a secret. It's kind of where I fall into this. And Dave, you mentioned your optimism surrounding the Falcons. Does that mean you're kind of more leaning towards the reload side of things? Give us your thoughts on what you expect, or, how if you were in Terry Fontenot's shoes, how you would have kind of handled the situation this offseason.
Yeah, I don't think it's any great secret that, I was an advocate for them seriously considering taking a quarterback. Understanding that 2021, one way or the other, was going to be a year where they saw what they had. I think if they had taken Justin Fields, they were still going to start Matt Ryan. They were still going to try this thing out and see how talented they were and how much coaching could overcome. But I also think that, this team rightly decided, I think, that Matt Ryan can be good, not just for 2021, but several more years. And I don't think that was the wrong decision. I think if I was in Terry Fontenot's shoes, I might have made a different decision. Again, thinking back to 2007 and the way that the Falcons were able to kind of, bounce out of the abyss that they had found themselves in by getting that new quarterback who ended up, securing the future of the franchise for well over a decade. But, when that quarterback that you drafted all these many years ago is as good as Ryan, you're using him this year anyways. This was going to be that bridge year, as I mentioned. So I think it was justifiable for them to say, we've got better coaching, we've got weapons we believe in, we're going to see how far that can take us. And if it's, as far as they obviously think they can go this year, committing to Ryan for 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 years is a perfectly justifiable decision. So, I probably would have been more team reload, or, rebuild and reload than just retool and try. But now that we're here, I don't think, aside again from trading Julio Jones, that it was a bad decision. And I understand Julio, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the Julio thing a bit later because I do want to get your kind of more in-depth thoughts on that. But Jake, I'll let you go for your first question for Dave.
Well, before that, it's funny. Y'all talk about the Michael Vick, in 2007. I was like 9, 10 years old when that happened. I really didn't know what was going on. And,
that hurts me.
Yeah.
You look at a guy
older,
like,
but not much. Yeah.
You look at a guy like Justin Fields, and I think Justin Fields is going to be fantastic. He plays for the Bears, so maybe not. I think they're still the only team in NFL history that's never had a 4,000-yard passer. That'll change this year with 17 games, I'm assuming, unless they split time with Dalton and Fields. But, it's kind of one of those things where I don't really think you could go wrong either way. And, I like this next quarterback class. If the Falcons are bad next year, I can almost guarantee you what they're going to do this time. But as far as my next question, I wanted to know who your sleeper draft pick, UDFA, camp body, just anybody that was brought in this offseason that you think is flying a little under the radar.
Yeah, I think I would say Frank Darby, but I think he's not really flying under the radar anymore. He's a guy that I think the fans already really like, and I know our guy Eric Robinson was high on him throughout the draft process, certainly once he landed in Atlanta. So maybe it's not fair to call him a sleeper anymore, but I do think he'll be a key reserve for this team this year. I think he can be more than that. So I'll go a little bit more under the radar than that. And Marcus Murphy is a guy that I like quite a bit. I think that the safety position is unsettled. It's all, short-term stopgaps outside of Richie Grant. We don't know how prominent a role Jalen Hawkins is going to have this year or beyond that. And I think somebody like Murphy, who I think has all the skill in the world but needs some time to refine it, is a guy that you could find on the practice squad or taking that last safety spot and ending up, again, becoming a key reserve over time. And, saying that key reserve for Darby and Murphy doesn't sound very exciting, maybe, but, the Falcons have lacked depth for years now. So I'd be pretty thrilled if both those guys turned out to be legitimate contributors for the Falcons. And I think they both have a chance to be.
No doubt. And we saw him with Felipe Franks at the Senior Bowl. And I think Felipe Franks might be my guy. I've spent a lot of time, you can see the flag above my shoulder. I spent a lot of time bashing Felipe Franks, but you look at some of the guys who were drafted, you look at Sam Ehlinger, Ian Book. Felipe Franks has twice as much natural talent as those guys have. He's got a cannon. I believe in him, and I think him and Darby, if they get a lot of time together, like I said, I like Frank Darby to take like a Donovan Peoples-Jones role on this Falcons offense, and I think he's going to get a decent amount of snaps, especially with Julio gone. But my next – go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say I'm glad you mentioned Franks too, because I kept joking about him being, somebody the Falcons would pick late because a lot of our guys really don't like Felipe Franks. But I agree with you in that it's interesting to see the Falcons take that sort of the opposite tack that they did for years with guys like John Parker Wilson, and really swing for upside with a developmental quarterback instead of a guy that, you can get by with for a game or two, isn't very exciting. So I'm hopeful that he'll at least make the practice squad, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I think JP Wilson falls into that the Bill Parcells. What's the rules for Bill Parcells? 4-year senior starter, won 75% of his games. Get away from that stuff, man. Felipe Franks has a hose, and my thing with quarterbacks, if they have one trait that you can work with, whether it be a strong arm, speed, something, I can live with that. But my next question was actually, your one draft crush in 2021 you wish the Falcons had took a swing on?
Yeah, well, I mean, we already talked about Justin Fields, right? So that ship has sailed. I won't belabor that one, but the guy that I was really kind of hoping they would take at the end of the day was Asante Samuel Jr. That's partly because, and this makes me feel older than anything else. I'm not that old, but, seeing some of these guys that I loved even 10 years ago and their kids are coming into the NFL, that's weird. But he's a player that, I thought his skill set, his playmaking ability would be a really good fit for this defense. And so I was a little bummed out that they didn't end up with him. I also, like many Falcons fans, I think was an avowed Kenneth Gainwell fan. I thought he would have been a lot of fun in this offense. So, both of those guys, I'm a little disappointed they didn't end up with, but I've also realized over the years that, nobody that I really want them to take is probably going to end up in Atlanta. And if they do end up in Atlanta, it's not going to work out the way I hope. So
it's interesting you bring up Kenny Gainwell. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm hoping that last point isn't true because I'm a huge fan of Pitts. Didn't think it would happen. I had my doubts, but I'm glad that he's here. And again, the last time I wanted a Falcons draft pick and it ended up being true, it was Vic Beasley. So I'm hoping, we get the good fortune this time around as opposed to, because I think a lot of people wanted Vic back in 2015. But I'll let you, what you wanted to add.
Well, it's funny you bring up Javonte Williams because he's been my guy for a long time, late into the fall. And then Denver moved up to use that pick. And I wonder if we'll have a J.K. Dobbins situation, which, that was obviously the pick we traded to Baltimore for Hayden Hurst. So I guess time will tell, but I'm a huge Javonte Williams fan.
Yeah, I mean, Javonte is definitely going to be a stud. And he was a guy that I had my eye on at 2.35. And Dave mentioned another one. I thought Asante Samuel was certainly going to get some consideration there as well. Ultimately, it didn't happen. I mean, they took another guy in Richie Grant that, again, I know Eric's high on. I was high on. I thought he'd be in consideration. That's what they ended up doing. So I think it'll all work out. But, that kind of brings me into my next question because cornerback depth outside of, AJ Terrell being the CB1, it is a bit concerning for me. And I'm curious, Dave, what are you most concerned about the Falcons heading into the 2021 season?
I don't know if it's a mental block for me or not, but every time, somebody like you says cornerback depth, I go, oh yeah, they don't really have that. And I just don't think of it as like my top concern, and it probably should be. But mine is been pretty consistent for the last 15 plus years, which is the pass rush. I do think that Dean Pease brings that blitz happy mentality to Atlanta. I think that'll help. I think I'm expecting a bounce back year from Dante Fowler. I'm expecting certainly a better year from some of the guys on the squad who haven't had a chance to shine yet. But I just don't see the pass rush once again being a consistent force for good for this defense. And it does concern me, especially with some of the depth issues in the secondary, that I still don't feel great about that. And, maybe that is a curse that we're going to have to endure forever post John Abraham. But at least for this year, it would surprise me if that ended up being a team strength.
Yeah, just a follow up on that, and you mentioned it with Dean Pease. Is any of that has to do with the fact that we're just coming off of a coaching staff that kind of relied on and needed a 4-man rush to make their defense successful, and this is a total kind of reversal of that thought process now with Dean Pease, where if he's bringing only 4 guys on the blitz or in the pass rush, I would guess it's like a 3rd and 20 situation, and that's when you'd see that. Outside of that, though, I think Dean's going to be throwing the kitchen sink at quarterbacks. And that's why I don't, for me, I don't list pass rush as much of a concern. Obviously, you'd love to have the individual guys, and any coach would. You'd love to have a Joey Bosa, but given the defensive coordinator and given his scheme, I think dialing up pressure, that's what he does, and that's why I continue to say, cornerback depth, and maybe depth isn't the right word because there is a lot of guys there. But is it guys that you can rely on outside, again, of A.J. Terrell? So I just, again, does that play into it all? We kind of all have to, as Falcons analysts, change our frame of thought as far as what type of personnel I think this defense is going to look like and need.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think that I expect the pass rush certainly to be more successful than it was for long stretches last year and certainly the year before. I just still question, again, where you do have an issue where the secondary maybe isn't as talented as you'd like it to be, certainly won't be this year, even if everything breaks about as well as it can. Even with creative blitzing, even with sending more guys, do you have guys that can get there quickly enough to impact a play? Are you going to be able to overcome some of the personnel weaknesses this pass rush has with scheme alone? And so, it's probably a little bit unfair of me to be as dour as I am about the pass rush, given that. But it is something that, at least until I see it, I guess, seeing is believing, I'm still going to have my doubts about.
Yeah, that's fair. That's completely fair.
Yeah, I'll go with the next one. I want to get your boldest take for the 2021 season. I don't want Matt Ryan throws for 4,500 yards. Give me something real. Go in your bag for this one. I want to hear something real.
Get spicy with it, Dave.
Oh boy. Yeah, I'm probably not spicy enough here. You guys can boo me out of here for this one. But, I think this is going to be a top 10 offense in the NFL. I know that's not super spicy, but I also think that the fan base in general has lost sight of what's going to happen here. And maybe in the same way that you mentioned, Peas and not worrying about the pass rush as much. I feel like the coaching staff is going to make such a huge difference for this offense. People are really sleeping on the fact that, Dirk Cutter might be the nicest man in the world, but he was a very poor offensive coordinator last year. And I just thought that he really dragged this team down, along with, of course, some injuries and some personnel issues that the Falcons faced. And I think, subtracting Julio from it concerns me. It is going to be something they have to overcome, but this is still a talented enough offense led by a really good offensive mind. And I think they will finish in the top 10 in points and yardage. And I think it'll be good enough to carry them to, you can't say 500 anymore. I don't even know what win percentage 9-8 or 8-9 are. I'm not that good at math, but at least that far, even if the defense is kind of, as I expect, not as good as we'd like it to be.
And some of it may be volume, but I think it'll still be a breath of fresh air, and I think it'll be a lot more conducive to winning, even if the stats do look similar. It's in some places in the offense.
Yeah, we talked with Aaron a couple of weeks ago about this, and prior to the Julio trade, I thought that this offense, could be one of the best, could be a 30-point per game juggernaut. Then now, post Julio trade, I'm talking about 27 points per game, 28 points per game, which is a couple points of an uptick from last year's offense under Dirk Cutter. Do you think that's feasible this year? Again, it all comes down to how quickly I guess they can get off the ground, which is also stuff we were talking about. But do you think that's feasible in year one under Arthur Smith? Because I totally agree. I think this is a top 10 offense, given the coaching upgrades that the Falcons have acquired this offseason.
Yeah, I think it's very feasible. And again, if you back up and look at last year, we were all pretty miserable last year, right? It's a 4-12 season. There's not a lot to hang your hat on, but offensively, this team was obviously inept at certain things, certainly in the red zone, but they were still a good offense. And they were a good offense even with, by and large anyways, with Julio Jones on the sideline. So, if you look at that and you say, all right, clearly there's enough personnel here to win with, even if you have basically zero ground game, you have a hurt Julio, You've got Dirk Cutter coordinating this offense. I think you add Kyle Pitts to the mix. You add Mike Davis, who I think is a pickup a lot of people are sleeping on. And then you add a totally new coaching staff. And yeah, that's absolutely within reach. It's just a question of, is everybody healthy? And, is the ground game going to be the force for good that I think it will finally be?
Yeah. Before we get into some of the current event topics, we touched on Julio quite a bit. We said his name. It's hard not to, even though he's not on the team anymore. And we kind of closed the book on Julio on the Julio chapter a couple episodes ago. But we'd be remiss if we didn't get your thoughts, by and large, on the Julio Jones breakup, and ultimately, what do you think led to his divorce from the Falcons, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's a variety of things, right? And I hate starting an answer like that because it always feels like a cop-out answer, but we're never going to know the whole story. Julio is somebody who I truly believe if Shannon Sharpe hadn't happened, would have kept this whole thing under his hat the entire way. Never would have said one word about wanting to leave. Would have probably come out anyways because that's how this works, but you wouldn't have heard it from him. But I do think that, the reporting on the contract situation is probably where that fissure opened up in the first place. Doesn't sound like he was happy with the negotiations, the way they went. I think the losing started to wear on him. Maybe there's something there about the change of scenery and the change of quarterback. I don't think there's any bad blood between Matt Ryan and Julio Jones or anything ridiculous like that. But I do think that over time, a series of grievances can really morph into something where you're like, I want out. And clearly he wanted out. And I think that the Falcons probably would have handled this a little bit differently if they didn't find themselves in the kind of cap-related bind that they did. I know I was watching interview with, I think it was Chris Collinsworth a little bit earlier tonight, where Arthur Smith was talking about how well that Julio trade kind of worked out for them because they needed that cap space. And so, I think it was a combination of Julio just over time becoming disgruntled, this team deciding that they needed that space and that they could make it work with the changes they've made to the coaching staff, certainly the addition of Kyle Pitts, and just all came together. It's still, I find myself occasionally like putting together a roster projection or something for an upcoming article and saying, well, with Julio Jones on the roster, like I have not gotten used to this yet. It hasn't totally sunk in that this has happened. So it probably will take a lot longer too. But I do think it's probably not just one thing. It just sounds like the relationship between Julio and the front office in particular was just very strained for a long time.
Yeah, I think the salary cap point probably is where the whole mutual aspect of this comes into play. I know, Julio in his first presser with the Titans, said this was a mutual parting. And I find that hard to believe from a football side of things, but from a business side, I guess that's where, the Falcons did benefit in some regard. They didn't have to tinker with any more contracts, didn't have to restructure and kick the can down the road with Grady Jarrett any more than they have to. So, yeah, I tend to agree. I do wonder, again, the relationship between him and Arthur Blank, if I had to put any money on it, that's kind of where I lean. But at the same time, I don't really blame Arthur. I mean, he did end up giving Julio what he wanted. It's crazy that Julio's never going to play a single down on that new record-breaking extension. Hopefully we get some more clarity, because I think that's the only thing that maybe makes things easier is knowing where this all went wrong. But at the same time, sometimes ignorance is bliss. And I think it's going to take a while. And that's why I don't think the coverage around Julio really should stop, because, again, for what he did with the organization, you don't just forget about a guy like that overnight. But appreciate you answering those questions. At this time, we'll talk a little bit about some of the current events. There hasn't been much, obviously, Dave, being the editor of Falcoholic, this is kind of the dead zone of the offseason. So the pickings are slim as far as, what you can talk about. But the Falcons did have some roster moves last week. 8 total transactions, I guess you can say. They signed 4 guys and cut 4 guys. So the signings, they signed wide receiver, kick returner Jeff Bidet, edge rusher Sharif Miller, nose tackle John Atkins, and defensive lineman George Obina. I didn't even know he was on the roster. So sorry, George, butchering your name. Apologies. And then they cut edge rusher Jeff Holland. We talked a little bit about him on last week's show, kind of a waste because he didn't last long in Atlanta. D lineman Eli Anku, who did get picked up by the Buffalo Bills on waivers. Wide receiver Greg Dortch, and edge Alani Pututau. Again, another tough name. But Dave, any of those four guys that the Falcons signed, of the four, who do you think maybe has the best shot to surprise and make the 53-man roster?
I think it might be Atkins. I'm personally of the mind that this team would like that big run-stuffing nose tackle type. I think it's the reason they picked up Anku in the first place. I think it's the reason it's my turn to butcher his name because I actually haven't said it out loud yet, but Olive Sagapolu. Is that correct?
I think it might be Sangapolo. There's like an N sound in there based on.
That's a Hawaiian thing. It's like Tonga Baloa, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. I am the word. All these years later, and I have not gotten better at anybody's name, and that hurts me because nobody pronounces my last name right. So I apologize for that.
Did I stop me? Did I mispronounce your last name?
No, I don't think you did. So kudos to you. Okay. But I get a lot of different things. I've gotten
myself on the back.
Yeah, you should. My favorite is Coyote. I get that one sometimes, and I'm like, that's just does not look like Coyote, man. There's an H in there.
I almost just did a spit take right there. I should have drank water during that.
But I do think that, the signings of those guys tell you that they feel like there's at least a reserve hole on the roster for a guy like that. And so I think Atkins, who was actually a pretty solid player for the Lions there for a little bit, and then I know he opted out of last season, probably has the best chance out of the four guys they signed. I think I'm always interested in athletic edge rushers, especially, again, because I'm concerned about this pass rush, as I've said a few times. But I do think these guys probably don't have a great shot with the veterans they've already signed. So I'd look to Atkins to at least, stick throughout most of the summer. If he has any practice squad eligibility yet, maybe he makes it that far at least.
Yeah. It's going to hurt me. I'm going to probably need a day when they eventually cut Deidrin Sanat. It's unfortunate that he never really got a shot in Atlanta, but I do think you're on to something as far as, bringing in Sangapola and now John Atkins, two, big, beefy, run-stuffing nose tackles. Kind of fits the mold that you've seen in DNP's defense over the years, and Sanat doesn't really fall into that category. So it's unfortunate, but certainly fans should be on alert for, Deidrin Sanat watch not making the roster. Jake, do you agree? Do you think there's anyone else of that four maybe that stands a better chance? I kind of think Sharif Miller might be that guy. Just, again, kind of touched on it a little bit. The quality of edge players isn't that great, and so maybe Sharif Miller can beat out a guy like JTM, or maybe even beat out a draft pick like Ade Ogundeji, who, Sharif Miller is a former 4th-round pick. Ogundeji is a 5th-round pick. But Jake, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, not too much to add. I think it'll be one of those two guys. But RIP all the Greg Dortch truthers. The dream is dead officially, I think, unless he comes back on the practice squad.
I love how insane it is being an NFL fan where there are Greg Dortch truthers out there. Like, he's been around long enough that had to develop, but we do this to ourselves every year, man. I remember the Brandon Harvey days, there's always one guy.
I mean, that's what makes draft season, I think, fun. You kind of latch on to specific players, and then, they develop hives, and you're the president of the hive. And pour one out for the Greg Dortch hive. I think it's interesting because Dortch did have some, return ability, and he kind of, there's a 1-for-1 swap here with Jeff Bidet, who also has some return ability. So maybe, he has an outside shot. I would think Avery Williams is going to be, the punt returner, and one of the greatest kick returners of all time, Cordell Patterson, is going to be the kick returner. But Bidet is interesting with his speed, and I know Arthur Smith had a similar burner on the Titans in Khalif Raymond, who maybe he sees some shades of Raymond in Bidet. But some interesting names outside of, again, apologies to George Obina. I don't know what his role is. I think he's just a camp body, but I can see Atkins, Miller, and Bidet pushing just because of the depth at those spots isn't great. Shifting gears to next bit of news, and again, there's not a lot to talk about here because it's kind of a formality, but we do have all but one of the draft picks signed. Kyle Pitts remains the only one unsigned. I guess the only question here, Dave, is how long do you anticipate those negotiations going on for with Pitts?
Yeah, I could see those going up to training camp. It's probably not worth reading into how long it takes to get those done, as long as, he's in camp. But I see that being maybe the move after we were told that a Julio trade would happen closer to training camp, which would have meant all those signings would have happened last minute. Maybe Pitts is the one that actually does happen that late. I think the fact that he hasn't signed yet, given the flurry of signings over the last week or so, tells us, there's probably a few kinks to work out. So as long as we don't get into Kyle Pitts holdout season, I can't handle that this year.
Yeah, that would be the cherry on top of just a crazy offseason, as if that negotiation became a holdout, and then we don't have our prize.
Who's the last pick to hold out? I guess Joey Bosa. I remember Crabtree did back in the day, but I guess Joey Bosa would he have been the last one?
Yeah,
I think that right.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Calvin Ridley took up until around the 4th of July holiday a couple years ago for his contract to hit. So that's kind of my expectation is by early July, before camp, we'll get something. Again, I wouldn't worry, but again, that's the last shoe to fall before we kind of have a clearer idea of the Falcons cap situation. I'm projecting it to be around the $8.5 million range. And then at that point, we'll see if they do anything. I tweeted that I don't anticipate anything major. They are going to need to eventually get, guys 52 and 53 to hit the cap, because in the offseason, it's only the top 51. They're going to have to sign their practice squad because that also counts towards the cap during the regular season. So at that point, you're not really left with much but your emergency fund. It would be nice if they could sign anyone. Dave, do you have any names or low-key signings that you would like to maybe potentially see them round out the roster with?
Yeah, I mean, Brian Poole is one. Very fond of Brian Poole. Obviously, big success story of the last regime, but just a good player and somebody that I'm a little surprised is still out there. So, tackling that cornerback depth by giving yourself, somebody can start for you and be a capable player in the slot, I think would be worthwhile. The other one is just somebody that I've been hoping would be on the Falcons since the 2011 draft, and that's Justin Houston. Money-wise probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it would scratch that pass rush itch for me. And again, there are just certain players you feel like should be on this team at some point, and Houston is one of them. And I never got Glenn Dorsey, so it's about time.
It's about time he gets something, and it'd be nice to bring him home. They always have that Grady Jarrett restructure in their back pocket. I figured they'd only use it if the Julio thing fell through, the Julio trade, but again, it would be nice to get that situational guy. Dean kind of had that in Baltimore with Elvis Dumerville, kind of had that a little bit, I guess, with Cam Wake in Tennessee. So Houston would fit that role. It's just a matter of can they make the money work, because, I think Houston's last deal was around $8 to $9 million a year. I don't think he's going to come back to play for anything less than $5 million at this point. Could be wrong. It'd be nice. Jake, have you given any additional thought at this point? Who's your top guy? I know you wrote an article on Sports Talk ATL about it. You can have one guy money.
Still holding out hope from Malik Hooker. Come on, give him to me. He'll play for like $2. His PFF projected contract's like $2 million. I know that's not 100% accurate, but come on.
Well, I think that is doable if you look at some of the safety contracts that were given out. The safety market's always been suppressed. And it's just a matter of, I know someone posted the Instagram clip. They asked him the question, I think it might have been Cam Marino. Did he visit with anybody, or did he visit with the Falcons? He said no. I know he's visited with some teams, and I think he's going to wait towards camp. But that would be great. I mean, Malik Hooker's a guy who injuries, unfortunately, have gotten in the way, much like Keanu Neal's career. but he's still 25 years old. If he can pass clean bill of health and stay healthy, him and Richie Grant, that'd be a great timeline to be on for those two for the next 5 or so years at safety. So I'm all for that. I gave up on that dream, unfortunately. For me, I think I keep going back to someone like Nick Easton. I really don't want Josh Andrews to be the starting left guard. And right now, if the season were to start tomorrow, it looks like he will be. I think that's terrifying. And it's a segue into, I think, our last topic here, talking a little bit about Matt Gano's injury, which, I had the good fortune of sort of breaking. And I appreciate, Dave over at Falcoholic and Jake and the guys over at Sports Talk ATL for trusting me on that and kind of riding with it. We're still waiting on some more information there, but it does sound like he had a surgery. My source told me right from the start that they believe he's out for the year. Hoping that's not the case. Either way, it doesn't sound like he's going to miss time, and that just takes a further hit to the depth chart, which wasn't very strong to begin with. So, Dave, what are your thoughts on the offensive line? I know that's a hot button topic for the Falcons since they've struggled, in the old regime there. Do you think the coaching will make a big enough difference given the guys that they have now?
I'd like to think so. That is a concern. As you said, maybe Josh Andrews ends up being, Chris Chester light and gets the job done for a year or two for them at that position. But I would not trust that. And I think, any length of time missed by a guy who, you were either penciling in to compete at left guard or certainly is perfectly capable of being your swing tackle disrupts the depth chart completely. I think you have to consider Jalen Mayfield as a swing tackle candidate. You got to go out and get somebody. I think another name that we haven't mentioned from free agency at this point that might make a ton of sense is Dennis Kelly. That familiarity with Arthur Smith, obviously, and the fact that he can play swing tackle credibly makes him a good pickup. But I definitely feel like today you need an undrafted guy to develop really quickly. You need to be able to trust somebody like Mayfield or Dahlman to take that left guard job and really not look back, which I'm dubious about for any number of reasons, to feel great about that. So I don't feel like they're done adding to that position group, even if, the additions are probably going to be pretty underwhelming. I felt that way before the injury, knowing that he could miss significant time up to the entire season. As you said, that puts them in a tough spot. I think it really does hurt the depth, and you don't want depth problems when you already have two starting jobs that are wide open. So I could feel certainly better about that. I think that's the only thing that has a strong chance of putting the brakes on this offense is not getting that right.
Yeah, we talked on last week's episode about what's going on with Caleb McGarry, since he's also been out and not a lot's been reported about it thus far in the off season. And, that has shifted, I guess, the focus for Jalen Mayfield's role, which originally it sounds like the plan was for him to be either the left guard of the present or at the very least left guard of the future. And now, his focus has shifted back to his college position at right tackle. And, ultimately he'll have to be a swing tackle too if Gano's out for, extended period of time. And, again, hopefully Caleb gets back sooner rather than later. But yeah, that was one of the surprises for me, was that the only guy that they signed on the offensive line, if you're not counting giving Gano the restricted free agent tag, was Josh Andrews. And again, for a team that was thin on offensive linemen, I think to begin with, that's alarming. So, my hope is the same as yours. I hope they're not done there. Jake, what's your concern level right now, given the Gano news and, given that Josh Andrews right now is the presumptive left guard starter?
If we're talking the Falcons offensive line, I'm at like a 6 out of 10 minimum at all times. I'll probably bump this to like a 7 or an 8. I don't have too much more to add. But, for a position that was already thin, it just sucks to lose Matt Gano, who's one of the.
Yeah. Ryan Nazeal is the guy that I kind of circled when I was looking at the undrafted guys from App State. 3-4 year starter at left guard. He's the guy that maybe surprises now. Keep an eye on. I think he's been running with the second team right guard. I don't know if that changes now with the Gano news and Mayfield, bumping over the right side, but they certainly need to do something there. I think to put our minds at ease a bit, because I know a lot of people worry about center too. I'm not as worried about center. Again, Hennessy was one of my favorite picks of the 2020 class, and I think hearing the reports and his development this year, the growth that he's shown already, I think is again a good thing, and I think he can lock that position down. And then you have a guy like Drew Dahlman who is going to push him. But for me, they got to do something to provide competition for Andrews. The name that I threw out, that again, it's kind of a pipe dream, but it harkens us back to 2015 when they traded for Andy Levitri, almost several days before the season started, I believe it was. But Andrew Norwell from the Jaguars, he was a guy that was floated around in trade circles. They ended up redoing his deal. I don't know if that totally eliminates the Jags wanting to trade him, but again, if the Falcons could swing something like that, again, it would be a home run type of swing, and it would also mean that they'd have to, rework Grady's deal. But that's a name that, again, that would totally put my mind at ease. He'd slide right in between Matthews and Hennessy, help Hennessy out, a guy that, in his Carolina days, was a Pro Bowler type player, and that's what parlayed him into getting a big deal with the Jags. And he's been still good with the Jags. I think that's gone kind of, under the radar because he's been playing for the Jaguars the last couple of years. But that would be a great swing. Again, pipe dream, but a name that if you ask me who could the Falcons trade for, since again, I'm reminded of Arthur Smith in his press conference. He referenced, which was weird, he referenced that Andy Levitri trade, and when he was asked about making deals all the way through the offseason, not just during free agency. So again, something to put in the distant filing cabinet in your head, but a name that can certainly upgrade the offensive line right away. But I've talked long enough, Dave. We appreciate your time. Answering all of our questions. It's been great talking with you, catching up. Before we get out of here, I want to give you an opportunity to plug all the great stuff you got going on at the Falcoholic.
Yeah, as you said, it's the dead zone, so we're not going to blow your minds with any breaking news here. Actually, hopefully, for the most part, because it's probably going to be bad news if it's happening right now. But we do have some series coming up that I think people will enjoy. Will McFadden is putting together an Atlanta sports history piece. I don't want to spoil it, but we should see the first article on Thursday. I think it'll be a lot of fun, kind of covers off on all the teams and some uniform history. Otherwise, we'll be whiling away the time between now and training camp with our Forgotten Falcons series, which I've really enjoyed doing, digging up the past there on some guys that maybe people don't talk about very much anymore. Evan Birchfield's going to be doing a lot of fantasy previews, and we'll be looking at things like over-unders, including a fun one tomorrow with Kyle Pitts would have him breaking the rookie tight end yardage record pretty handily, which I think in a 17-game season is not as outlandish as I thought it would be before I read the draft. So, we'll be having fun with that stuff, and then hopefully training camp will be here before we know it.
Yep. So definitely give all that great content a click or two. Jake, what do we got going on? What you guys got going on at Sports Talk ATL? You want to?
Oh, we're all on the Hawks right now. Not much Falcon stuff going on, but we're handling all the news as we can. But if you want to follow me, Twitter, Instagram at Can'tGuardJake.
All right. Well, again, Dave, thank you so much for joining us. If you're tuning in this episode, make sure you like, subscribe, rate the show, give us comments. We appreciate it all. It really goes a long way. So for Dave Choate, Jake Gordon, I'm Matt Karoly. We are Talking Birdie. Go Falcons.